Hello, and welcome back to the Writer's Block. I'm Erica, and we've got Mason, Cameron, and Jonah joining us here today. And today we're talking about characters, dumb ones who use their agency to do stuff that's not that great. And the jumping off point for this episode is going to be a comment that was brought up in our last recording where we're discussing the adaptation of Shadow and Bone and how they have the same event happen, a bunch of people die, but in the TV version, the character is given more agency beforehand. So it is indirectly her fault that some characters die, and it's not brought up because the TV show goes to follow the course that was set out in the book. And so we have more agency without more accountability. So I'm interested in hearing how the rest of you treat this. How do you deal with a character who makes dumb decisions? Do you call them out on it? Do you have them recognize it later? Or what are the benefits of just letting people doing something dumb and letting the reader figure out it was a bad idea?
I personally think it a little bit sticky in the climate that we find ourselves in right now. There tends to be an increasingly loud voice in genre publishing at this point that requires a kind of moralizing in your storytelling where you need to flag really clearly that, hey, this is bad behavior and it either has to be punished or you as the author have to sort of editorialize and say, I know that this is bad, I'm not advocating for this behavior, which I personally find to be a little off-putting and fourth wall breaking. So I don't love it. But again, I do recognize that we do have some responsibility as artists to not put forth behavior that others might emulate. I call it the Fight Club effect, right? The Fight Club, if you've ever seen that movie, like, it's a bad idea. The guys shouldn't be doing it. It's stupid men who are doing this. And yet, it's not clearly presented as such. It is sort of compelling because it's Brad Pitt doing it, and you're like, well, I'd let him hit me in the face. That sounds great. But so I get that there is a line there that needs to be trod, but I don't love this, oh, you can't have bad actions without showing the consequences or without commenting on how this is bad behavior so people don't think you're a bad person. That seems dumb to me.
As we were preparing for today, I was thinking a lot about my character Clayton Moore, from the Rebellion series, who makes, I think Clay is pretty dumb in some ways. I think Clay's pretty dumb in some ways. In that he throws himself into extremely dangerous situations for very idealistic reasons, and often gets himself hurt or faces drastic consequences as a result, some of which will be highlighted in Prison Break, the book whose cover is sitting right behind me and has sat right behind me ever since we started this YouTube channel. Yeah, I don't know. I think that every action has a consequence. I do not believe that there are isolated incidents, if only insofar as I believe we all spend our lives reacting to our own actions, right? In some way, shape, or form, whether that is assuaging guilt and asserting that we're fine, or being racked by that guilt and trying to figure out how to fix ourselves, or just totally different things, right? So I really like stupid characters. I like them a lot because I think we all, at least in some way, shape, or form, are stupid. That's just me, though I could be off and seeing the world incorrectly because I am stupid. Whatever the case, I think a lot of us are kind of dumb, but maybe dumb in different ways. And when we see characters be dumb in our particular way and face consequences that we might have faced or we might fear facing, I think it's cathartic. And I think catharsis is a really big deal. Anyway, that was long. Someone else, please speak.
I think Mason brings up a really good point that real life people are dumb. I do many dumb things all the time. And I think the reason readers expect characters to not be dumb is because readers don't actually want characters to be realistic. They want them to be likable. They want them to feel self-flattering. You want to believe this character is who you would be on your very best day, and maybe a little bit up from there. And Cameron, you're talking a little bit earlier about how authors feel uneasy because if you make a character do a bad thing and they're not called out on it, then there's always the potential that that action could reflect back on the author. I think sometimes it's really valuable to have a character make a dumb decision because then the reader is the one who's left with the discomfort. There's a book I really love that I read about a decade ago. It's called Prisoner of Time by Carolyn B. Cooney. We can put the title in the show notes, but it's a time travel romance where the girl is this white Anglo-Saxon Gilded Age heiress, and the opening chapter starts with her sitting around with her friend talking about what an ideal romance is according to 1890s standards of femininity and class standards. And her friend, who is a minor character we don't get to see very much after the scene, is planning an elopement with her family's Italian gardener. And she's just gotten a love letter smuggled from this boy. And she thinks her boyfriend's name is Johnny. And she's reading the love letter and she sees his signature at the end. It's the first time she's ever seen this man's name in print. She says, guess how Johnny spells his name? Gianni. Isn't that romantic? Isn't that exotic? And as a modern reader, you have the effect of, honey, I don't think you know what your boyfriend's name is and you're planning an elopement. And in historical romance or time travel romance, the obstacle between characters who have a race or class difference always seems to be that the parents disapprove, less so that the lovers don't know what they're getting into. And nowadays, having your parents disapprove of the person you're marrying is less of a big deal, but getting to know somebody from a different background, that is a problem. And that's something that everybody has to make smart decisions about when they're getting into a relationship. And it involves a lot of learning and growing to find out how you're going to make a life for yourself and this person you're having a romance with. And I really liked that moment of discomfort because these characters can't call themselves out because they have the biases of the time that they live in. And you as a reader have this moment of, wait, I don't think she's ready to go into this elopement with him. It's not fair that he's going to be marrying this girl who does not even know what his name is. And so in some ways, I think it's very beneficial to see characters make dumb decisions because the obligation to call that out falls on the reader instead of a character. And you could teach some lessons there if moralizing is what you're going after.
See, this is kind of a squishy subject for me, just because, especially in the novel that I just wrote and I'm querying right now, I tend to have my characters make all their dumb decisions before the novel happens, and then the novel is just them dealing with their dumb decisions. And so it's like half in, half out, where you don't see the decisions, but you do see that they're dealing with consequences. But in the novel I just finished writing, there is also a moment where I very deliberately have my main character do something unlikable. Like I have him, essentially I have him be a transphobe for a scene. And the reason I do that is because there tends to be a difference between characters making dumb decisions that do not need to be called out, and those ones don't need to be called out because everyone can probably agree that it was a dumb thing. Like everyone can look at that and go, that was wrong, you shouldn't have done that, face the consequences. But with important like social and in some cases political issues like that, you kind of need to take a stance one way or the other, because not everyone will look at that and go, that was the wrong thing to say, or that was the wrong thing to do. Some people will look at that and go, that's what I would have done too, good on ya. And so if that's not the kind of reaction that you're going for, you kind of need to call them out on that, because otherwise you are leaving that kind of interpretation up to the reader. And I'm of the opinion that you don't leave everything up to the reader's interpretation, because then you're not writing the book, they are. But I think the other big difference that I wanted to point out is that there's a difference between a character making dumb decisions that are supported by their character and by their past actions, and a character making dumb decisions specifically because they want because the author wanted them to make this decision to further the plot. And I have so many examples from shows and books I've read where the character does one single thing and I just go, you have lost me completely. That makes no sense. But there are also tons of times where either my characters or other characters have made really dumb decisions. And sometimes I will literally put in the prose, this character knew this was a dumb decision. He was going to do it anyway. But that's because I've taken the time to set them up to be a reckless, dumb person who will make those kinds of decisions and not think about them. So while there are certain bigger issues to talk about when talking about what kind of decisions you should call a character out on, there's also just the fact that sometimes you don't need to, because everyone knows your character already by the time they've made that decision.
I think Jonah brings up a super important point there. There is nothing more dissatisfying in any piece of media than getting the sense that the writers of whatever it is are just forcing a character to act out of character in order to further drama or the plot. It's infuriating. I can't tell you how many shows I've stopped watching because of this, where it's like, I'm watching a show written by a bunch of hacks. I'm out. I just can't do it. But on the other hand, you've got to have some bad decisions. You've got to have some chaos, or you're not going to have much of a novel. So I think what you're talking about with having pre-established weaknesses or fatal flaws or something of that in that mode can then realistically push the plot forward. I'm reminded of a book, The City Stained Red by Sam Sykes. Pretty decent little sort of D&D style adventure. It's infuriating to read, not because he does it badly, not because he has people act out of character, but because every single one of his main characters has one huge fatal flaw, and he pushes every single one of their buttons, and so they're all doing the stupidest possible thing. And you've got like this group of 5 or 6 heroes, and every single one of them is just tripping over their own feet because he's specifically set it up in this way where it's like, I'm going to do the dumbest thing possible because I can't do otherwise, because this is the person that I am. It's actually a lot of fun to read, but I was so like, that one went a little too far for me in that direction, a little too much chaos. But there are even some folks who will allow sort of a dice roll to affect how they're, speaking of role-playing games, there are some writers who will actually roll to decide what their characters are going to do in their novel and then write accordingly. That's a little bit more control than I'm willing to give up in my writing process, but it does lead to some fascinating outcomes.
If I can really quick bounce off of the kind of other aspect that Jonah talked about, namely kind of taking a second to speak to certain like decisions or flaws or things like that, as opposed to just leaving it to the reader to do that. I do think it is also important to say, and I will keep this brief because I think this is a really big conversation that we're not really planning on talking about today. But I do think that every author makes statements, whether they are subtextual or textual, right? And I think maybe that's the hardest part of being a writer, if you also want to be a considerate person. Not necessarily saying that like every single issue has to be covered by every single book or what have you. But I do think, like, I, for example, am a religious person, and I also really enjoy studying theology and studying philosophy and things like that. And oftentimes, as a result, represent those things in some way, shape, or form in my literature that I write. And I think that that can be tough, right? Because if you start writing a fictional faith tradition, if you start writing a fictional philosophy, if you represent characters' fictional philosophies, oftentimes you say something, people might think you're taking a certain philosophical stand. Or they might think that you're making a certain statement about, spirituality or organized religion or things of that kind. And so I do think that not only when it's a pressing matter of current justice movements, or a pressing matter of human decency that people disagree on, or things like that, but just generally speaking, I think authors make statements whether they're trying to or not, and it's important to keep that in mind in what your characters do and say and think.
Another thing we've all kind of alluded to a little bit is that characters oftentimes need to make dumb decisions to set up a plot. And people always talk about making a character proactive as if that's making a character better. There's the maxim that, oh, if your villains are acting, your heroes are reacting, they're doing it wrong. And I think one reason people tend to make their characters more reactive is because the more agency you have, automatically the more accountability you have, and sooner or later your decisions end up hurting somebody. I really love the I Am Not a Serial Killer books by Dan Wells, which is about a teenage boy who is a sociopath, and he really wants to be a serial killer when he grows up, but he knows that's not the best and becomes a demon hunter instead. And in, I believe, the 5th book, he learns of a demon living in a small, quiet Midwest town where everybody just gets along with their neighbors and lives in peace and harmony. And so he shows up in this town full of anger and full of all these serial killer mindsets, and he's fully prepared to kill something. And as soon as he shows up in the town and gets angry at somebody, that person dies. So he thinks, well, okay, well, who's my suspect? Maybe it was that person. And as soon as people want to kill that person dies. It just keeps going on and on and on, and the cycle of violence where every possible suspect turns up dead, and the only thing all the victims have in common is that somebody was angry at them. And he comes to realize that the defining characteristic of the monster in this town is that the monster doesn't have agency. So she just does whatever people around her want her to do. So the way she's been able to live with her monstrosity is she found herself a small, quiet Midwest town to live in, where all anybody ever wants to do is live in harmony with their neighbors. And it worked just fine until his kid showed up to save the day. And he created this horrible cycle of violence in this town just by being there and being angry at somebody. And that was a really interesting study in agency for me reading that book, because I thought, this kid has solved every problem just by existing in the setting. And in that case, it's a book about a sociopath. So it makes sense that he has some dissonance where he doesn't personally accept blame for this massacre he's inadvertently started. But I thought, if you write any other character like this, you need to have this moment of reckoning of, oh no, what have I done? If only I just stayed out of town, because this is all indirectly my fault. So really quick before we have to wrap up, how do you deal with characters who need to make dumb decisions in order to further the plot?
You got to set it up early. You got to make repeated reference to whatever it is that leads to the dumb behavior that's going to cause the problem, and establish it as a part of their personality. Then it won't come out of the blue, and readers will roll with it. Honestly, especially in genre fiction, readers will roll with whatever you tell them to. You just have to prime them right. And the only time you're going to run into trouble is if you just insert problem in the middle and it doesn't make sense for the character.
Well, more specifically, I think you need to set it up early, and you need to make that reckless, dumb decision-making part of the character likable. Because you can have all the characters you want who have been set up perfectly to make dumb decisions, but if the readers don't like those characters, they won't like those dumb decisions and will stop reading. And so specifically what I did with that character I mentioned earlier, who makes a dumb decision, my narrator specifically points out that it's a dumb decision. 2 chapters earlier, I had the love interest go, I love how reckless you are. I love the dumb decisions that you make and how often you make them. Like, I made it a part of their relationship and a part of the desirability of the main character. And I think specifically that was what helped it feel more natural when it came time to have this character do this horrifically dumb decision.
I do think, kind of to that point, and also to the point of what Cameron was saying, I think a really good thing is to make the decision emotional or idealistic. Because I think, and this is again just kind of my personal take on things, but I think a lot of the time when people make their dumbest decisions, it is either because of their ideology or because of their emotions. And I think that's something that we can all relate to, right? I think we've all done stupid things because we cared about somebody, or done stupid things because we cared about someone and we felt like they didn't care about us, right? Or we've done stupid things because we really believe in something and as with preconceived notions and missed the truth as a result. And so I think a lot of the time, the more that we can tie our characters' dumb decisions to their emotions and to their ideologies, not even necessarily good ones, right? Their ideology could be nihilism. The more that the things are tied to that, I think the more human it is, and also the more relatable, the more that we can kind of resonate with those decisions.
Really love the points everybody's been making today. Does anybody have some closing thoughts before we go and sign off this recording? All right, thanks for joining us, fair listeners. If you have any questions or comments about characters making dumb decisions or favorite dumb decisions you've seen characters make in media that's really kind of itching at you, let us know in the comments section. Until then, see you next time, Blockheads.